Once upon a time, in a hollow hill between two high mountains, there lived a dwarf. The dwarf had lived there happily for a long time, and therefore it took him by surprise, when one morning he woke up and felt irritated and quite discontent. After some speculation and thought, he went outside and realized that he really was not getting any sun in his little habitat. The mountains were too high, and for most of the day, the rays of the sun did not find their way over the mountain tops. There was nothing else to do, he decided, but to move, so he hurried back into his hollow hill to gather his belongings. But he soon realized that he would not be able to carry all his things by himself, and he would need help, preferably some kind of a beast of burden. Luckily, the dwarf now remembered a troll that lived in a cave, not far away in one of the mountains above his place, and that the troll owned an ox that would be exactly right for the job. The dwarf immediately began climbing up the mountain, and soon was at the entrance of the troll's cave. He knocked with his walking stick on the rock as loudly as he could, but the troll did not hear him, so the dwarf had to resort to shouting. Finally, the troll came sloughing from within the cave to the entrance, but it had a hard time eyeing the petty dwarf. The dwarf had to shout with all his might in order to attract the attention of the troll, and when he had finally succeeded in conveying his errand, the troll flatly refused to lend him the oxen, and then returned cursing, hissing and spitting, back into the darkness of his cave. The dwarf was furious. He had never been insulted so grievously in his life. His overgrown pride swelled in his chest, and he decided to teach the troll a lesson. On the other side of the mountain, road builders were hard at work. In a shed close by, they stored many cases of dynamite they used to clear the way for the road. The dwarf knew of all this, and immediately proceeded to the shed where he stole most of the explosives, and then he spent all the night carrying it to the mouth of the troll's cave. In the early hours of the next morning, a huge explosion rocked the mountain, and both the troll and its oxen were blown into smithereens. Not only did the explosion kill the troll, but it blew a huge gap into the top of the mountain that let the sunlight through. Now the dwarf's hollow hill was bathed in the rays of the sun for most of the day. Of course, the rocks and the huge boulders, thrown high up in the air by the explosion, had to come down, and down they came, most of them on the other side of the mountain, right on the top of a beautiful cliff formation that had some time ago become the home of a young elf family. The elf couples that lived in the cliffs had a beautiful young daughter. As it happened, the elfman was away from home at the time of the explosion, but sadly his wife and daughter both perished in the bombardment of rocks and boulders. When the elfman came home and saw what had happened, he was at first overcome by grief. But when the bodies of his wife and daughter had evaporated as elfin bodies do, his grief was replaced by rage. He climbed the mountain with great speed, and from the new big pass created by the explosion, he saw the dwarf dancing with joy in the sun. The elf hurried down the mountain, and asked if the dwarf was responsible for blowing up the mountain. The dwarf readily admitted that he was. The elf then securely bound the dwarf to a stake and cruelly burned his beard. Then he made ready to behead the dwarf with his own axe. But as he heaved the axe aloft, it occurred to him that he wanted to learn more of the reasons and events that led to the dwarf's actions, and consequently the death of his family. So, he began to question the dwarf, who answered all queries truthfully, hoping to delay his own death a little, of nothing more. That is how he learned of the dwarf's sudden discontent with his living quarters and his decision to leave. When asked why he had, suddenly after so many happy years, become unhappy with his living arrangement, the dwarf had to think long and hard. Finally, he answered. It began, he thought, one day not so long ago, when he observed a young elf girl walk and play in the sun, on the sunny side of the mountain. She radiated with happiness and life, that somehow seemed to illuminate his soul, and then it all disappeared, when he returned into the shadow of his home. This, he decided, must have affected him more than he was aware of. Hearing this, the elf's rage subsided, and he decided to let the dwarf live. That evening they talked for a long time, and the elf told the dwarf a strange story. Long ago he had lived with his wife, in his father's cliff palace. His father was a rich elf, and kept a large horde of cattle in the meadows by the river that flowed nearby. It was his responsibility as the oldest son, to guard the cattle during the night, and the great ox that was valued beyond all other property his father held. His father told him that he had a reason to believe that someone would try to steal his ox, and he would have to show great vigilance. But then one night he fell asleep, and when he woke up the ox was gone. It had been stolen by a great troll. When he told this to his father, the old man in great rage banished him forthwith from his home and riches. He had been forced to take up residency in a hitherto uninhabited cliff formation, namely on the other side of the mountain. Both the elf and the dwarf came to the same conclusion, that the troll was really to blame for all the recent unhappy events. Obviously, the ox the troll owned was the same ox stolen from the elf man's father. But one thing still bothered them. Why had the troll stolen the ox, since it had not eaten it? As a rule, trolls ate everything they stole, if it was at all edible. They decided eventually, that the only one who could possibly answer that question, would be the elf's father, whom the troll had clearly been out to seek revenge upon, by stealing his ox. Together with the dwarf, the elf now traveled, all the way to his father's cliff palace, and there they managed to attain the presence of the old rich elf. He listened to their story, and as it progressed, he became more and more somber and sullen. With a heavy heart, he told them, that he knew why the troll had stolen his priced ox. When he was a young man, he had once been fishing down by the river near the waterfall. Suddenly he heard strange noises. After a short search, he discovered 2 troll infants, on a sill behind the falls. In the waterfall, constantly beaten by the cold glacier water, he now recognized the petrified shape of a female troll. She clearly had just got her babies into the shade and darkness behind the waterfall, just before the sun rays had gotten to her, and turned her into stone. Left there in the damp and darkness, waiting for their father to find them, the troll infants started to shriek as children do, and that sealed their fate. In accordance with the accepted behavior code of the day, the rich elf slew the infants, and buried them in the meadow, where he kept his horde of cattle. Their grave was in fact marked by the most unusual bush of roses, that grew henceforth on that spot. The young elf was quite disturbed by his father's story, for he had just realized the fact, that the reason he had fallen asleep the night the ox disappeared, was the sweet bouquet from those roses, that made him drowsy, and lulled him to his dreams.